I feel like I need to get a mug that has some sort of logo on it to really maintain my credentials as a software engineer. Like get paid a shit ton of money and you just wear free stuff.
Yeah, like as much as I don't like in-person conference, I'm still a little bit uncomfortable with in-person conferences. I can now restock on like pens and mugs and t-shirts.
Hey folks, hope everyone's doing well. Let me try and share my screen. Looks like we might have a quick meeting today, which should be great. I think I'm still catching up from being at the conference all week last week. We'll get started in 1 minute. Is Bobby here?
Hey, yeah, I'm here.
Oh, hi. Yeah, great. Glad you're here. You're going to be the bulk of the meeting today, I think. So glad that you're here. We'll get started in like a minute. And anyone that hasn't been here before, please add your name to the attendees list, but also if you haven't been to any of these meetings before, stick your name on the welcome new friends thing and we'll call on you and ask you just to say hi to everybody. All right, cool. Let's get started. So yeah, is there anyone that hasn't been to this working group meeting before? Okay, cool. No one knew this year or this time. Okay, cool. Let's go hand it over to Bobby. So Bobby's here to talk to us about Cargo Vet. He is from Mozilla. I guess Bobby hasn't been to one of these before, so I'll let you introduce yourself, Bobby, and you can take it away.
Yeah, is it all right if I share my screen? I got some slides. Yes? Okay.
Yeah,
Let's
absolutely.
see. Let me see if I can do this.
Absolutely, but let us know if there's a problem and we'll try to fix that.
Good. Okay, so I click share and I do that.
Yes.
Is that showing up?
It is.
Okay.
Looks good.
Oops, now I need to take that, move that over here, move this back over there. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think I have this working, but if like the slides don't move or something, somebody please like shout. Okay, so yeah, I guess I also I should raise my hand as a new person here. I've not been to this meeting before, and I very much appreciate being invited to talk to y'all today. I'm Bobby Holly. I'm a distinguished engineer at Mozilla. And I guess something about me, as of this month, I have been working on Firefox for 14 years. So yeah, I am here. Dustin invited me to come and talk about Cargo Vet, which is a new system that we're building at Mozilla and with some partners to help ensure the integrity of third-party Rust dependencies. So this tool is running in production for Firefox today. However, we haven't really done like a general release yet. And I would say, strictly speaking, we haven't even really announced it. But nevertheless, like people lurk on our email lists and word spreads. We've already got a fair amount of inbound interest, which I generally take as a good sign that we're on the right track. Our near-term objective with this is to secure Firefox, but our long-term objective is to secure the ecosystem. And so it's very important to us that we build a tool that people actually like and want to use. And it's especially important given the design of CargoVet, because the tool has has network effects. So the more people that use it, the less work that anybody has to do. Did the slide transition there? Yep. Okay. So why are we doing this? Firefox has, of course, been around since long before Rust was the thing, and has always had its share of third-party C++ code. But it was never really all that much because there was just like a ton of friction involved in pulling something in. Like you had to have lots of discussions, and maybe you had to talk to a lawyer, and then maybe you had to figure out the build system integration and like all that kind of stuff. And so as a consequence, it just was not something that we did all that often. It was usually easier just to go and like write the damn thing yourself. But then Rust came along and had a modern package manager. And suddenly everything on crates.io was just a one-line manifest change away. And this was like a huge productivity boost. And so I would say we were reluctant to just outlaw third-party crates in the build. And so we didn't, and we quickly ended up with something like 400 of them. And in theory, people were supposed to audit the code that they were pulling in, but it was a fair amount of work, and it was pretty difficult for us to enforce that systematically and make sure that it was like always happening. And the thing is that like a lot of these dependencies were very widely used in the ecosystem, used all over the place by major companies. And unfortunately, though, there was no way for us to know whether anybody else had actually gone and looked at them, or if like all of the players in the system were just jointly herding around these mystery boxes and hoping for the best. And the truth is, there is a limit to how much energy everyone can devote to securing their supply chains. And so the harder it is, the less likely it is to happen. And I assume that I don't need to convince people in this meeting that it is important to secure the supply chains. So it's something that we definitely want to get done. And so therefore, the driving principle behind CargoVet is to minimize the friction and make it as easy as possible for everybody in the system to do the right thing. And so in that spirit, we've done a number of things. We've made sure that it's trivial to set up, that it fits unobtrusively into everyone's workflow, that it streamlines the whole audit process as much as possible, and most crucially, that it allows the entire ecosystem to share in the work of auditing stuff. So next, I guess I want to give like a high-level overview of how the system works. So you've got a repository with your code, but it's unfortunately not really all your code because you've got a bunch of these third-party mystery boxes. And so naturally, you are concerned about this, and you decide to enable CargoVet. And enabling CargoVet just involves adding the tool as a linter and creating some metadata in your repository. And this takes, I don't know, like 5 minutes. And crucially, it does not require you to go and audit all of your existing dependencies. The ones that you already have get a free pass because they're automatically added to your exemptions list. And the point of doing this is to make it very low effort and very easy and not a big thing to bite off to get started, and then tackle your backlog incrementally from the point of an approved state. So then suppose sometime later, a developer comes along and tries to pull in new third-party code. And this new third-party code might be a brand new dependency, or it might just be an update to an existing dependency that happens to release very often. And so this new code is not exempted. And so CargoVet will reject the push. And of course, the goal of CargoVet is not just to be stop energy, but to be user-friendly and sort of help you accomplish your goals. And so it also helps the developer figure out how to resolve the situation. And the first thing it does is to scan the registry to see if there are any well-known organizations like, for example, Mozilla or Google that have already audited the package before. And if there's a match, CargoVet tells you who it is and offers you the option to add that organization to your trusted imports. And so what this system does is it allows you to sort of lazily, at your convenience, build up an increasingly wide set of approved crates that you can trust. But of course, it may be the case that the developer needs to audit the code themselves. And that can take some work, but CargoVet streamlines the process of auditing to make it as easy as possible. So often somebody will have already audited a different version of the same crate, in which case CargoVet computes the relevant diffs and identifies the smallest one for you to review. And then regardless of whether you're auditing a diff or the full crate, it helps you pull up the goods for inspection and record the results. And of course, you can do this inspection locally, But I'm excited to announce that we've also partnered with SourceGraph to offer a rich audit experience in the browser. And SourceGraph has some very impressive technology here. For example, like the indexing works correctly across both removed and added lines in a review of a diff, which is very nice, and it sort of works exactly like you'd expect. And so I'm pretty excited about this because it's a much friendlier audit experience than reading the diff in your terminal. And it allows people to be sort of more excited and more enthusiastic about doing audits, and also do these audits with higher fidelity. So another thing that CargoVet does to minimize friction is to store the audits in tree. And this means that developers don't have to navigate or even authenticate with any sort of external system. Like, they already have a change set that's adding the new third-party code. And with this, they can just submit the relevant audits directly as part of that change set. And of course, as mentioned before, CargoVet has these sharing and discovery features, but these affordances are built on top of that system. And they do that by pointing to the audit files in the repositories of the other organizations. So this also means that there's no central infrastructure for any kind of attacker to compromise. The only way that you can spoof an audit from Mozilla is to compromise the Firefox repository itself. And I can assure you that we have lots of people who make sure that that doesn't happen. So CargoVet also has a number of other fancy features under the hood. You can define custom audit criteria. You can require different types of audits for different subtrees in your build graph. You can filter out platform-specific code that you don't care about. But these are obviously very useful for large projects, but they're also all completely optional. And the baseline experience is designed to be very simple and hard to screw up. And that's because we really want this to be something that everybody, sort of both large and small projects alike, can use without devoting a whole lot of headspace to it. It just sort of does what you expect. So yeah, I would say that's the high level. I was told that I only had maybe like 15 minutes total for the presentation and Q&A, so I didn't go into too much more detail than that. But obviously, questions are welcome. Happy to elaborate on any of the aspects of the motivation or the design, at this point. And of course, we'd love any feedback of how this might work better for you or your organizations. And so definitely, well, yeah, let's take questions.
Yeah, I want to steal everything as usual. I did have, hey man, great artist steal. I have some questions, just some small ones. One was, it seems to me as though because you want the audit to go with the change, it more or less has to be done by hand at the moment.
Say what you mean by done by hand?
So for example, if I'm updating, libfoo, and I inspect libfoo changes to see that I'm satisfied that nothing naughty has happened. And then I include the audit.yaml. I'm not exactly sure of the details because
it's a TOML.
Chance to look at it.
Obviously, like
of
a
course,
big security difference.
It's Rust,
YAML,
a TOML. Yeah. Just more double brackets. Yeah. Sorry, where was I? Oh yes. So would I need to include that in the same commit, or would it be a follow-up commit?
I mean, generally speaking, you probably want it. The audit needs, if you're using CargoVet as like a linter and that linter is gating check-in, then the audit needs to be part of the store before the commit lands. So it could be a follow-up commit. You could certainly record the audit ahead of time. Even in its own push. There's no restriction on recording audits that aren't strictly necessary yet. But the basic workflow of how it works is, the developers they're trying to do the push, and then it says like, as when you're running your linters, either locally or, on CI, it will say, CargoVet failed. And you type like, okay, CargoVet. And then it tells you, well, this is, this dependency is missing an audit. And then right there, it provides you like a command that you just copy paste into your terminal, depending on whether it's like an absolute inspection or just a diff. So you might save like CargoVet diff, like libfoo 1.1, 1.2. And then it will sort of, it will pull up by default, either the local view or the web view for doing the inspection. And then when you're done with that, you type CargoVet certify, and then it will remember what you had just inspected and provide you sort of, a textual description of the, the stuff you're supposed to be auditing for. And this is kind of like it's kind of like a Git commit thing where it opens up an editor and, you sign your name at the bottom. And then that will automatically go and put the change in the entry audits.toml file. And so whether you want to then take that and add it to your existing change set, or you make a new change set, or however you want to do that, it's up to you.
I don't want to monopolize question time, but I will ask or make one more before I get off the queue and wait to come back in later. One thing we've talked about in this group before is the idea that SigStore should record far more than just signatures, right? Where signatures are really an attestation of authorship or committership. But we also want to see events committed to the transparency log, like this dependency was pushed, but also this dependency was inspected by person X and they said opinion Y. Do you see something like that being something that could be evolved, or would you see it as like a monitor watches the YAML and the TOML and then replays that into the transparency log? Does this make sense to you, or did it just kind of?
Yeah, I mean, sort of like an additional aspect of transparency on top of whatever is in the Firefox repository or the WASM Time repository,
Right.
or what have you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's potentially a fair amount of value in that. Like, it's I would say that the fundamental model for Cargo Vet, like I said, is to just lean on the existing repository security models that these sort of large, well-known projects have, right? Because obviously, like, if you can, if you figured out how to compromise the Firefox repository, like, you've got, there are much more interesting things that you can do than spoofing audits, right? And so, I would say that is the baseline. But I think that, potentially, like, as an additional layer of transparency, there's potentially other things that could be done. But I haven't, I don't think we've, it's not part of the core operational mechanism.
I would be happy to talk about that offline, or perhaps in Slack.
Yeah, sure.
To talk more about the ideas we've discussed before. But I will now yield the floor to David.
Okay, I've got, I think, 2 quick questions. Question 1, if someone wants to learn more, what URL should we go to?
Oh, goodness. I probably should drop something like that in the Slack, huh? Let me...
Or in the chat or whatever.
Yeah, let me see here.
I see bhellynet / cargo-vet.
That now redirects to mozilla.github.io/cargo-vet. So let me go ahead and drop that into the channel here.
Okay.
That's
so the Mozilla Cargo Vet URL would be the good place to go for more information. Awesome. All right, question.
That's right. And there's also a GitHub repository, which I think is linked to somewhere in the book, but it's the Mozilla GitHub repositories / Cargo Vet. And so that's sort of where the code is happening right now. I will say that we have intentionally, there's a dummy Hello World crate under Cargo Vet right now that's published to crates.io. And we specifically have avoided publishing one just because we've got a couple of people that are just kind of iterating on the features and making sure it handles all the edge cases and that sort of stuff. Anybody that's using it right now, we kind of want to be really in the loop and filing issues. But probably in maybe 2 weeks or something, we'll do a general release.
Awesome. I just added that to our notes that Slack goes away soon and the chat disappears at the end of this call. So the notes are where we want to keep this stuff. Second question. Yeah, second question. Have you had any communication with the OpenSSF security reviews folks, security-reviews project?
Not yet. No, I would love to talk more.
Okay, I mean, I similar goals, not similar approach, but at the very least, I think it'd be good to chat with each other. And I have put a URL for that project in the notes. I will post it into the chat. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would also say that the thing about the Cargo Vet system is that the basic flywheel is designed to be projects that are trying to sort of manage their own dependencies, and in the process of managing their dependencies, they're auditing them, and then they're sort of sharing that work that they've already done. However, there's totally space in the system for an entity that simply whose job it is to just audit stuff, right? So even if you didn't, if you wanted to go and audit the top 100 crates on crates.io, and then you were a well-known entity that people trusted and you published an audits.toml for that, then everybody could go and pull that in, even if you weren't, strictly speaking, using those dependencies yourself.
Thanks.
I think I got my hand up. So
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I'm not sure. I don't.
No, just following through. No, just I see, sort of decentralized, you mentioned, in terms of the individual organizational repositories would have audits of interest that they've done, but there's a registry area. I was a little unclear about how that registry works. How could I find an audit that an organization has done?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and you're totally right that it was, it's like a bit of a hand wave at this point in the slides. Like I didn't go into it in too much detail. But the basic model of what the registry does is that people, it's just like a list. Like for now, I think we're just we're storing it in the CargoVet like source repository itself. But it's a list that CargoVet fetches that just maps like entity names to the URL of their audit files. Right. So it doesn't actually contain any audits themselves. It's just a directory service. But what that means is that when CargoVet is like trying to run, it's like, oh, like I don't have an audit for version 1.3 of Foo. It can just check the registry and it can go just fetch all of those audits from the organizations, whether you trust them or not, because it's not, pulling them in as part of your trusted set. It's just sort of looking around. And then if it finds one, then it can say, oh, hey, look, like Google has already audited Foo version 1.3 or 1.3. That's not good enough now because Google isn't in your trusted imports. But if you were to add them to your trusted imports, then this and a number of other things would, just start passing in the future.
So as an auditing organization, I would basically put in a PR against CargoVet to add my entry to the TOML file, right? Listing the version. You said it's versions, so it's a name version sort of lookup, or is it checksum?
No, sorry. I mean, it would just be a name and then the URL, like your organization and the URL of your audits file. And then CargoVet would then, when somebody's CargoVet failed, it would go and just fetch everything from the directory. And then if it noticed that your organization has actually audited the thing that was needed, or something that was perhaps very close to what was needed, and then you could just like audit a little diff on top of that, then it would, inform you. And then depending on like how big the organization is, like I would say in Mozilla's case, if some developer ran into this issue, and then it was like, oh, like I want to go pull in like OpenSSF's like audits. Individual developers wouldn't have the authority to add an entity to the trusted list, or rather they could add it, but then it would get reviewed by our security like supply chain module, right? Because we watch that TOML file, and then we would say, hey, oh, somebody's trying to solve this problem by pulling this in. Do we think that's a good idea or not?
Thanks.
Sorry, yeah, there's several hands, and I'm not sure how to adjudicate which one.
I think it might be me. I think the question kind of was addressed by Jason's question before. And I apologize because my laptop decided it needed to restart immediately after you started talking. So you might have said this, but I guess maybe you could just sort of summarize what you're imagining it seems like this is mostly team focused for now, but the upstream model for like how there'll be a shared vet amongst a community of resources there. And I think you kind of described it like if you have trust in some organization's project, you adopt their vet. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, the basic idea is, different organizations, like well-known organizations, like Mozilla is, we've got our audits file up there already. The Bytecode Alliance is going to be doing one with WASM time shortly. I've had a number of back channel conversations with well-known organizations that are potentially interested in doing this as well. And so the idea is that, organizations are producing their own audits, and they can choose or not choose to, import them from other organizations, like as fits with their, threat model and security decisions, but that these audits are published, and then people can choose to say like, I think if Mozilla's audited this thing, then that's good enough for me, and then they can just automatically import all of the audits from Mozilla, and then if they try to import some package that they haven't audited but Mozilla has audited, then CargoVet will pass. And the original model that we had there was that like kind of upfront in configuring CargoVet, you would kind of look at the list of organizations that were doing this and choose which ones you wanted. But then we decided that was actually, in the spirit of making it easy to set up, that required you to make sort of a bunch of like upfront decisions. And then we switched to this lazy model where you don't have to add anybody upfront. And then when you run into this problem of like, well, now I have to audit this thing. And then you start wondering, well, gosh, does like anybody else out there like already looked at it? And that's the moment when you sort of, when there's potential value there from importing one of these other organizations' audit sets, and you can make that decision.
Sure. Okay, cool. So kind of a follow-up question there, since this group is sort of like broadly focused across lots of different ecosystems, the model and mechanics and maybe like the format for the policy file and the audit file or whatever it might be, like how tied to the Rust ecosystem is that, or how much could it extend into other ecosystems, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say currently like I would say the idea is not particularly Rust specific. The specific implementation and exactly like how it's integrated into traversing your build graph, like that, those parts are of course Rust specific. I would obviously love to see this succeed in other ecosystems, like obviously like JavaScript and Python are ones that come to mind. But I think that you know, several people have come to me and said like, hey, like I want to like extend this to like Node.js right now, and I've suggested like, hey, like let's wait a little bit, because I think that, you know, right now we're kind of getting this thing off the ground in Rust, and we're iterating on the design and that sort of thing. And I fully expect that there to be potential like small changes that we make, you know, just to make the ergonomics better for people, and as we figure out how it scales. And then I think if we can get this thing working in Rust and we can really demonstrate that, yeah, like a very wide community of stakeholders like is interested in using this and getting value out of this, then I think that would be a useful proof point to then go and look at one of these other language ecosystems and then say, based on what we learned and how Cargo Vet worked, like, you know, what could we deploy for one of these others? So I'm interested in other language ecosystems, but I think it would be more effective just to wait a little bit.
Okay, we'll stay tuned then. I think maybe Apu or Jacques is next. I'm not sure.
Apu is next.
I was just kind of curious, like, at what granularity can you write policy? Can you trust certain actors at Google and maybe not others? And then if like the Google orgs kind of pool of auditors changes, is that something you should be aware of?
So the basic trust model is, I mean, fundamentally, I mean, it's the domain trust model, right? Of like, you know, who controls the files on the domain. But the, you know, the thing that you import is a URL. And so it would depend a little bit of like whether Google decided to publish, you know, separate audit files for, you know, team X and team Y, or whether they wanted to publish a consolidated Google audit file as to, you know, how much granularity you would have on the imports. There is a mechanism we've spec'd but haven't implemented that allows you to sort of specifically exclude certain audits from your imports. So like, you know, if somebody's, you know, if there's, you agree with 99% of what this organization has audited, but they like actually approved like one thing that you sort of, you know, have some philosophical objection with, then you can kind of specifically strike that one out. But generally speaking, it's a little bit up to the organizations of what they, you know, of what granularity they publish with. I think, generally speaking, I think people's instinct within the organization is to think that like they're very different, you know, that the different teams are quite different, but that the, you know, perception from outside the organization is just like, well, this is that organization and that's the brand. And so I do think that teams are going to have to figure out a little bit, like, you know, within Mozilla, right? Like we have Firefox, and then we have like a number of other you know, smaller projects, like including Cargo Vet itself, you know, in the Mozilla GitHub repository. And the question of like, you know, how much do we combine these, or, you know, do people, you know, have separate imports for these, you know, is something we have to figure out. But I would lean towards, you know, the high level, like, you know, this carries Mozilla's stamp of approval. I think that's kind of the most understandable granularity.
And is there like a negative signal? Like, can you say someone audited? One person audited this and said it was okay, and one person audited said it was no, and then you make it
right. So there's a directive for the audit where, you know, the normal thing you do when you audit is you say like, this looks good, but you can also say like, no, this is a violation. Audits are defined in terms of criteria, right? So this, like, you know, you're auditing for a given set of criteria, and there's some built-in criteria. And if you say like, no, this crate actually violates those criteria, you can mark that. And then that will just like prevent the thing from being allowed on anything that's pulling in those imports. And the reason we have this like exclusion thing that I mentioned just a minute ago is, you know, in case like two organizations get into some like fundamental disagreement of like, well, this is unsound, but like, well, it's like, we think it's like totally fine, you know, or something like that. You don't want like you don't want somebody's import to like totally prevent your project from being in a good state in a way that you have no control over. So there's that override capability.
Okay, cool. I think Matt was next.
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-on, and maybe you've answered this partly, but when you introduce the term audit, that's usually very loaded. It implies that there's a standard with a framework, a set of controls, checklists, certifications for people who followed, you know, certain steps they have to follow, control lists and things like that, ways of recording your audit results and things like that. I mean, it seems like this trusting an org that at that level of granularity is not enough, that there has to be some rigor behind it and such frameworks and controls to ensure that audits are performed uniformly across different orgs, or at least an attempt to do those things. Have these things been discussed at all?
Yeah, so I will say, you know, as part of the system, like I mentioned before, like audits are defined relative to criteria. I didn't get into the talk because it's, you know, it was perhaps a level of detail more than I could fit in 10 minutes. But yes, there are some built-in audit criteria, which have specific text of like what is what you should look for and what is allowed. These are, and I think they're specified in the book, and also showed to you on the command line when you're doing this. But the built-in ones are safe to run and safe to deploy. The main difference is that safe to run is that this thing is not actively going to compromise you on its own, and safe to deploy is this thing is hardened against untrusted inputs, and therefore, like even if exposed to inputs in the wild, it will also not compromise you.
Is there going to be any type of programmatic way to certify or certain conformance, like checklist conformance? Say I've done these audit steps and here's how I've done them, and here are the tools I've used and things like that.
Not at that level of granularity, no. So the way it basically works is that like I can say in Firefox, we have the audits are, well, all of CargoVet's metadata is stored in a directory. The default directory is the top level supply chain directory. And so we have a specific governance module that governs that. And whenever somebody submits something to that, we look at it and we perhaps go and talk to the person, like depending on, our level of, like whether this is a very senior engineer that we have a huge amount of confidence in versus like a relatively junior person. Certainly if it's an external contributor, that might be something we just wouldn't accept. But so we have some degree of governance processes like around what audits go in and get the Mozilla seal of approval. But there is not an attempt to standardize what the seal of approval means across organizations. I don't think that is particularly tractable.
But you're implying that there are people involved, so it would still require some level of recording of signatures and things like that, right? Signatures of the people you approved to perform the audits. I perform this audit and I'm submitting this audit, or these people contributed to the audit, right? So it's like the trust chain. It goes back to org level, back to you rely back to individuals. To go back to individuals, you have to have identities, you have to have signatures, basically. So it's kind of like unfolding the layers of this thing, so.
Yeah, but the way that the identities are managed is by the same way that identities are managed in our existing code development processes, right? Like people have authenticated with our code repository that allows them to submit code to it, and certainly that also allows them to do reviews. So when somebody submits an audit or submits a patch that adds an audit to the TOML file, we know who they are. And
so tools like Scorecard could unravel those things, get back to identities and the actual commits and things like that, and sign commits and things like that.
I don't know exactly what you mean by sign commits in this case, but we have a code development process where somebody comes along and they submit a patch under their identity, and that shows up in our Fabricator, and then we have different policies around reviews in different directories, and then those have to get reviews by the appropriate authenticated people using sort of Mozilla's processes, and then when that all gets approved, it gets landed. I feel like I'm not sure I'm really understanding the question.
Maybe I can try rephrasing it.
Thanks. Go, Jacques. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think Matt is thinking in terms of like what we talk about a lot as attestations, which is some statement of fact with an attached signature that has an identity, like some proof. Something can be proved that the attestation was created by person X or by identified workload X in some cases. So for example, at the moment, the identification is relying on the Git commit is what I'm hearing. So like who is the author or the committer of the commit? I think
who submits it, I would say, not the commit itself.
Okay, so like the submission, the PR submission, you mean?
Well, I mean, Mozilla, we don't use GitHub for our development. We use something called Fabricator, but it would be similar.
Yeah,
but whatever the existing access control policies of the repository are is what CargoVet leans on.
I think what Matt was getting at is he's looking for the path for strong authentication to link the identity so that he can follow the trust chain back to the organization in a way that doesn't rely simply on the source code itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that the baseline design of CargoVet is to rely on the repository, right? That this repository is the thing that the organization is putting forward as something that it is standing behind, that this is, whatever the Bytecode Alliance GitHub organization, there's the WASM time repository. That is the thing that people are pulling releases from and sort of implicitly trusting whenever anybody's using code from them. And so that is sort of That is the attestation point.
Okay.
And the organizations use their existing processes for accepting code to, in whatever governance model they set up, to figure out what audits get included in that source repository.
Okay, so I think there's a further conversation we can have. I don't know whether today or it's on the Slack about what kinds of method of attestation people want. So for example, at the moment we have a tool called GitSign, which creates a digital signature that is written also to a transparency log. So there's a very strong public record that person X was responsible for commit Y. That doesn't rely on the commit itself. But I won't go into that too much. I had some questions I wanted to follow up with.
Sure, and I'll say, on that specifically about like individual developers doing some sort of signature, that is an explicit design choice of CargoVet to not require any sort of additional identity or authentication beyond whatever they use to interface with the project repository itself. Specifically because it is a concern about like friction and then making it much more difficult for developers to participate in the system. Because, if I'm a Mozilla developer and I'm just like, working on Firefox code, I'm landing Firefox code all the time. I have my little workflow on that. And if suddenly I'm in the thing where I have to, create like a new public identity or get a, figure out a public key or all that kind of stuff, that was some friction that we are intentionally avoiding.
Okay. So I have some questions which are unrelated. I've got three. Sorry, Joseph, I know it'll take a little while to get through these. The first one is there some notion of saying that I trust like N out of K audits, or I trust any two in this group of 5, something like that?
It does not exist yet, but that is something that I think would be very, it's something we've thought about and would be very easy to do on top of this.
I mean, yeah, like for example, for, speaking with my Shopify hat on, there's a number of other companies we would trust to audit. So if we saw 2 out of GitHub, Airbnb, Square, and Stripe, we'd probably be like, this is sweet. This is fine with us. So that would be very useful as a capability.
Yeah, and that's something. Yeah, something we're very excited about as a possibility. I think the first MVP of this, is getting to the point where you can import most popular crates on crates.io, and at least one entity will have signed off on that, which is a strict improvement over what we have today. And then once we do that, then we can start adding the redundancy in of having multiple entities do that. And then once several entities require several other audits, then you'll start to get that duplication in based on people's policies. So I think it's very doable. It's just like the next phase of success.
Because I imagine, extending on this, I imagine there'll be like a lot of out-of-band arrangements. This is also slightly touching on what Matt's asking about auditing. I think like the definition of auditing in some sense is not technologically described. It's out-of-band agreements between different parties that they will recognize each other's audits because they've agreed to some approach. So I had a question is, there's a terminology we use a lot when we're talking about attestations, which is predicate. I hope I'm not using this wrong, Trashank, if you're still on the call, which is something that comes out of in toto, which is basically like your verb or action for the thing you did. And there's an example, I think I put a link into the docs for a project from some PHP folks called Gossamer. And they have like various, what we would call predicates, like vote against, reproduce, spot check, code review, and security audit were like the 5 different things that they mentioned. And I was curious what those were for CargoVet.
Yes, so there is only one verb, which is audited in accordance with the associated criteria here. But audit records specify what the criteria are. And so if I would say probably like the default here is security audit. And like I sort of described before, there's those 2 levels of security audit of, like actively malicious versus hardened against untrusted input. But you can certainly, there's affordances for specifying your own criteria and for mapping those custom criteria across different projects. So if you want to introduce sort of other concepts of what people might be doing, that would be done by specifying criteria. So I guess, so it's there's one verb, but a number of nouns or no, not even nouns, a number of adverbs perhaps.
Yeah, you're taking me back. Yeah, I guess in the long run, I'd hope that this group can help to suss out some common terminology or common taxonomy, because one of my goals in participating in this group is that my peers in AppSec and InfraSec should not need to run multiple monitors to deal with different ecosystems. They should run one monitor that has a common language to the degree it's possible. The last question I had was about private auditability. Like, can I have audits that I only reveal to my own organization? Because a lot of organizations will want to perform audits, but they will not want to reveal what dependencies they have.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's the model that I described is a little bit of a simplified model in that it assumes that like everybody's source repositories are open source, right? And when the source repository is open source, you don't have to do anything fancy because you just like point to somebody else's, you point to GitHub/Bytecode Alliance, or you point to hg.mozilla.org/Mozilla Central, and that's where you find the audit file. It's just you're pulling it out of the source tree, and nobody has to do any extra work to publish it. Obviously, if you have some sort of private project, that doesn't work. And so what you would do then is you would have a mechanism by which you pull the audit file, you sync the audit file out of that private repository into some known public location that you then add to the registry. There's an additional affordance, which again was a detail I didn't get into, of handling multi-repository organizations that want to consolidate them. There's an affordance called CargoVet Aggregate that allows you to sort of aggregate audits from like a bunch of different things and create sort of one unified one that sort of points to the thing that it originally came from. So that, for example, if you have an organization like, I would like to be able to pull in, Microsoft or Meta or something like that. And I know that these organizations have a whole bunch of different a whole bunch of different software repositories under their roof. And it is not a particular, it may not be a detail that I'm interested in of, exactly which one it is. And so that's what that aggregation affordance is. But yeah, generally speaking, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know if I heard what I was trying to dig for. And Joseph, I promise this is the last interruption I'll have, which was if I'm Meta, I might want to reveal some of my audits, but I might not want to be revealing all of my audits because I don't want to signal to potential attackers what dependencies I have. Different companies have different levels of paranoia around this. We've had informal discussions with other companies about doing like this general idea for Ruby, and it has come, one of the sticking points has been that some of our peers are like, we don't want to publish what dependencies we have. We do want to do audits and we want a recording mechanism for it, but we don't want to have to share that publicly.
Right. And so I guess what I'm saying is that assuming if you're in a world, if you have some project as a company that you don't want people to know what the dependencies are, I would assume that project is not open source, right? Because if it was open source, then somebody could just look at this, or, if it was public, somebody could just go look, regardless of your audits and see what you're using. And so in that case, it's in some private location. And the default would be that you didn't share your audits with anybody at all. And if you wanted to share your audits with somebody, you would, build some, the simplest thing would be something that like, rsyncs the file to some public server. And then if you wanted to do something a little bit more complicated, where you wanted to have a policy of stripping some of those audits out, like you wanted to share some of them, but not all of them, whatever that synchronization tool you would then have to grow some stripping capability. And I would be totally open to building that into CargoVet if we had a clear sense of what the use cases were and like, some common mechanism that would be applicable to other multiple organizations. But I do suspect that in the early days, it will not be that difficult for people to kind of just hand roll whenever they need for that.
Thanks. Joseph, all yours.
Sorry. I think actually, meanwhile, all my questions were answered, but actually maybe let me summarize if I understand this tool well. So currently it's just a table file with audits, right? And there's a CLI tool around this file, which you can manipulate with the predefined structure. And also the CLI tool is capable of helping you doing the audits. So it can actually show you the differentiations between two cargo versions of crates, right? So in the end, it's totally non-invasive, right? Because how do you version that file, how people are changing that file, it depends on your project. There's nothing actually around. It really depends. It's the same as your. It can follow the rest of the project and how do you version your code, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's really the idea, is that we want this to not take headspace from people, right? Because it's going to be something, Mozilla, we have hundreds of developers that work on Firefox, and to make this a very sort of cheap investment for us to make, the easiest way to do that is to avoid adding like 2 hours of friction the first time like each of those developers like bumps into this thing and has to figure it out, right? So if the answer is this fits in your workflow, you're just modifying the code as you were, just stick it in your patch. The theory is that goes a long way to making it lower cost to deploy.
So that's the idea behind, right? So that's just file. How do you version it? How do you keep the changes? Which line was changed by which person? It depends then on your project, and it's nothing built in this system.
That's right. Yeah. I will also just say that there's the audits file, and then there's also a separate config file that allows you to do things like specifying different policies for parts of your subtree, and that's also where your list of exemptions is stored. But the basic idea is conceptually there's sort of two files. Like the audits file is the thing that's shared with the ecosystem, and then the config file is the thing that's kind of like private to your project. And that's sort of what that is the design criterion of what information goes into each of those files.
That's actually, thanks for the answer. That's what I was asking.
Cool. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I'm glad that we ended up with a relatively light agenda, because I definitely took more than my allotted 15 minutes.
No, that's totally fine. Any other folks with questions right now? Cool. Bobby, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I think everyone is super interested in the topic, and we'll be excited to see where CargoVet goes, and maybe how we can sort of generalize it across some other ecosystems, because I think there's definitely a demand there. So yeah, thanks again. Super cool project. Please keep in touch with us. I see you're in the Slack, but like, let us know as things progress or as things change. Definitely clue us in.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, thanks again for everybody for having me. Thanks for all the questions and feedback. I'm happy to talk sort of more about any of these topics. And, most importantly, we've got sort of ad hoc inquiries from various companies that are interested in using this, who are using Rust and would be interested in using this sort of concretely to secure the Rust supply chain. But if y'all are familiar with any other companies, your companies or ones that you work with, or organizations or projects for which this might be a good fit, definitely reach out and let's talk about the use case. Because the more organizations that use it, the more successful it'll be.
Sweet, thanks again. Moving on, I just stuck a quick FYI in the docs here. Let me share my screen back again. Sorry, Sigstore published today about their plans to go GA. I think that's probably relevant to most of the people here. So I just want to make sure folks are aware of that. And that's all I have to say about that. I don't know, does anyone else have anything they want to add there? I think I saw Bob on the call.
Yep, I'm here.
Nothing to say. Cool. Yeah, I mean, this is great to hear. So
yeah, I slipped in a quick additional agenda item request, if you don't mind.
yeah, let's go.
So it's in the notes here, but basically, I think many of you know that the OpenSSF mobilization plan was put out as 10 streams. The question obviously is what to do next. At the time, we were just focused on the what to do and not how and who, but that does need to get answered. One thing that's being mooted, no decision made, anything like that, but it basically trying to come up with a bunch of groups, calling them SIGs, and Stream 10, which involves improved supply chains, looks like something that maybe could be created in support to this and report up to this working group. As I said, nothing set in stone or anything like that, but just want to give folks a heads up that that's a topic of discussion.
And if you have questions, you can feel free to reach out to me or David on that.
Yep.
I mean, I have a question. Like, we don't really have any governance in this group, right? So how will that sort of work in terms of reporting up to this group and this group having some sort of influence over that?
Yeah, that's what we're currently in the middle of talking with both the governing board as well as the foundation staff around what is the correct execution model. And if you look across all of the 10 work streams, there's quite a bit of variability that exists. So we're as David noted, like we're still in the middle of trying to codify approaches that work across the diverse set of activities across the work streams. But certainly in the spirit of open source, if folks see short-term shovel-ready projects that, you know, out of this discussion or out of the broader work out of this working group that align really well with something that was identified in that mobilization plan, we're looking to, as we pull that model together, we're looking for things to kind of sanity check it against. So if folks do have ideas of things that, hey, if you'd like to kind of request funding or resources or map up to some of the evangelization and the recruiting that has been done to get more people interested in funding this, we're trying to figure out the exact logistics there. So if folks have other questions or ideas, like I said, feel free to reach out to David or I to help put that together. It was still early days of sketching that out.
Yep. I just figured it'd be useful to, in the spirit of transparency.
Yep.
You know, that's great. And I know we had talked a little bit about that when for the folks that were in person in DC back when we were talking about the streams, we sort of were like, yeah, there's a lot of overlap here. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else for the agenda? Otherwise, a couple minutes back.
This was a great session. Thank you, Bobby. That was really interesting.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah,
positive
thanks.
and exciting.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.